Thank you so much. Ladies, thank you so much for being here. I think this is the only all-female panel, so I'm very proud of this for us. And talking about an issue that is, of course, so central and so critical to getting right for this region and also for the world. So I wanted to just start on this one point. I mean, when we talk about the confluence of issues complicating food security in the region, most times you think about there's war, there's geopolitical tensions, there's debt burdens that communities are dealing with, there's global warming. I wanted to sort of gauge from all of your expertise what you think is maybe the most pressing issue that is complicating food security in the region at this point in time. Fatmata, do you want to start?
Yes. So for me, based on my experience working in the rural areas with women growing food, I think we also need to highlight ancient grains. We need to diversify our foods. We are not diversifying enough. And this involves also taking these grains, making it 21st century foods. And also, we need to stop overemphasizing on small-scale farming. We need to prepare for large-scale farming, because you look at most of these rural areas, or just farming in general, most of the, you find a lot of small-scale farmers, right, but there's not enough large-scale. So we are not thinking way ahead. And also, there are varieties of foods that we need to tap more into. Right. You go to the market, you can easily find rice from Thailand, from China, but you can't find local grains like millet, like fonio. So people are not eating that enough. Right. And I think it's very important to start thinking about self-sustainability. We need to be nationally self-sustainable more, and that involves also making agriculture a priority because our lives depend on it.
Right. Tatika, jump in here.
Yep. Thank you, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be invited to this distinguished panel. So to provide a context of what I will be sharing in this discussion, we at Degas, we are working with smallholder farmers in Ghana, around 31,000 of them, and we are doing 1,000 acres of regenerative agriculture. So as somebody working with smallholder farmers, the biggest challenge is the high input cost of agricultural production, exacerbated by the war, and most of all, climate change.
Sara, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I wish there was one issue. I think that the thing that makes our food systems, whether actually in Africa or anywhere else in the world, sort of what they are, is that they're deeply complex and they're very intertwined. And so the different sort of points that you made, which is debt, climate, geopolitical tensions, and then just the lack of sort of scale and sort of productivity gap that exists on the continent. I mean, they're all sort of interconnected, and it's hard to say today if this one thing got fixed, everything would be fine. There sort of isn't that magic bullet approach, which is why changing systems takes time and sort of why, you know, why it's so complicated as an issue. But I would say there isn't a single issue. The confluence of issues, though, is truly unprecedented in terms of just the number of things happening simultaneously. And I would say the one factor where the pace at which disruptions has been much higher than normal is climate.
So then how do you even start then changing things, considering what you said, Sara? I mean, because a lot of these things are not controlled, right? A lot of these things, farmers do not have any control over what the climate or what the floods are going to be. The war may or may not continue. Food prices are going to continue to spike and lower. I mean, where do you start then with resolving some of these issues?
I think support. It has to start with supporting farmers. Some of these
grains... Who is that, though? Who is supporting?
We as people, you know. And one thing, for example, like the grains I've been talking about a lot, which I believe is very sustainable. Things like fonio and millet is drought resistant. You know, you grow it within 8 to 12 weeks, you can harvest. But farmers are not growing enough. They are growing for sustenance for themselves because it's very tedious to produce. It's easy to grow, but when it comes to processing, because some of these grains are so tiny, there's not enough mechanization. So they don't have the tools to actually grow more of this food. So mechanization is very important. Training, equipping these farmers with the right tools. Make sure they can place value also, because farmers also need to understand the value of what they are growing And that's one way to scale. If they understand the value, they can ask for a fair price. And most of the times they just go to it. So you go down there, you give them a peanut, they're also in a hurry to just collect it because they don't understand the value of it. And also some of the challenges in these communities that I have experienced with my work is that a lot of organizations have been going into these communities, making promises that they don't keep to. So farmers or just women or people in rural areas are not open anymore because there is no trust. So we need to also build trust because there are no contracts in these communities. When you say you're coming to pick a bag of rice or a bag of fonio, you should keep to your word. So they are not open anymore to collaborate. When they see you, they just think about cashing out now. They are not thinking long term. So even when you're bringing this project, you're telling them that, oh, we are building something. We are trying to create a space where you can scale and equip you the right tools. They don't believe it. They just want to cash out today. So they're not thinking long term. So it's a lot of things.
But we've seen some investment into things like fonio and millet from different countries around the world. I mean, does that go far enough? Is that sort of helping farmers sort of get by and address some of these issues, would you say?
No, really, because there's no market also. Market also is another thing we need to create. We need to create space for market. If they are growing a lot of fonio and locals, it's not localized also. People are not eating enough of it. And there's no market locally and internationally. It still doesn't solve the problem.
Tatika, how have you been able to support farmers in scaling their own businesses?
So what we have been doing is helping the farmers to adopt climate smart agriculture, to make them, to give them easy access to finance, providing them high quality inputs that would improve their crop yields, help them adopt climate resilient strategies in production. So by the aid of technology, so we at Degas, we are implementing, we are creating our own large language machine of a QA bot that helps and asks questions using our frontline agents in the farm. And we are using this large language machine to develop solutions to prompt early warning systems for our farmers. We are also encouraging farmers to adopt regenerative agriculture, which is a set of farming practices that focuses on restoring and improving soil health, biodiversity, and ecosystem functions. We believe that regenerative agriculture is the solution, is a viable solution in the continent because most of the African smallholder farmers have been doing it. Practices such as crop rotation and intercropping. And in a case study in Burkina Faso, they call it Zai technique, where the farmers have been digging holes to store rainwater, to capture rainwater, and it has tremendously improved the vegetation cover of the land, increased their crop yields, and at the same time sequestering carbon in the atmosphere.
Why are we not seeing then the food insecurity crisis improve? You know, if these things are being implemented, I mean, what is it that is not being focused on at this point in time? Jump in.
So these practices are small scale. So I want to summarize everything. When you do, Fatma is saying that we need to enable the markets, but also on the other side of the coin is the production. But in this ecosystem are enablers. Enablers such as government policy, such as private investors believing in food security. So I think these stakeholders need to work together to scale it up in the next few years.
Sarah, would you say it's working anywhere across the continent? Are we seeing any of that public-private partnership that Tatika is talking about?
I think, you know, there are one-off case studies, I think, from a country, but let me start with why it's not working.
Okay.
And it's because the inherent cost of capital is too high to do any work and sort of, I would say, in our agricultural systems globally. So if you see what makes agriculture in the US work, which is, you know, the sort of most food secure country in the world, pretty much exports every type of food product.
Right.
And you see the backbone of the financial system on agriculture for the US, it's entirely backed by the US government. Like the US government plays a massive role in backstopping the loans, the insurance policies, all of those. The financial system of agriculture in the US is still very heavily dependent on the US government, unlike other sort of financial markets. Like the energy industry is nowhere close to as dependent as the agricultural industry is. So when you sort of say, can Africa replicate that? The answer is no, right? Because you need the financial might of governments that, again, are actually too indebted to be able to sort of set up that type of backbone of sort of financial infrastructure. Then you say, what countries have done it without sort of that backstop? Brazil. So Brazil's entire agricultural industry was built actually largely through sort of commercial means. Where the government invested heavily was in replenishing the soils and essentially creating the right soil infrastructure over decades to then sort of enable the large-scale financial sort of infrastructure that needed to go in, but it was private industry. Now, when private industry went in Brazil, it went in large-scale farms. A small-scale farm in Brazil is a large-scale farm in the U.S. So just when you think of sort of scale of investment that went in, it was that, and it was sort of having the right financial systems in place, the right R&D. Government invested in R&D. Government did, and sort of let the market sort of figure itself out. It works very differently than the U.S., but it has worked. Now you say, okay, what's working in sub-Saharan Africa? No country has really adopted anywhere close to that level of investment that Brazil has had in R&D and in setting up the right policy frameworks to let sort of private industry thrive. But when you look at yield increases and just national yield increases, and you say which countries have shown some promise and some progress, Ethiopia is one, right? And that's not a story that's told enough. But if you look at yields of pretty much all the core grains in Ethiopia, you've seen a rapid increase, while the rest of the continent has actually been relatively static. And that's actually because it set up an institution which at the time was called the Agricultural Transformation Agency with the goal of transforming agricultural systems. It meant making very uncomfortable discussions, very unnatural partnerships. And that has had some lasting effect where there is some glimmer of hope. Now, there are still some challenges around scaling that there because capital markets are not fully open, the financial markets are not functioning the way they should. So there's still some cap to the upside, right? But I think that ultimately the biggest challenge is money, and the biggest challenge is pricing capital correctly and setting up the right financial institutions to do so. And I think until we do that, we don't solve for it.
What does that mean then for countries that are, already heavily indebted, as you mentioned? Investors are already risk averse to going in and investing in, a Ghana or a Zimbabwe or something like that. I mean, should they be trying to replicate some of the policy framework that Ethiopia did, or should there be another approach?
I think there needs to be a Pan-African approach that's different than the version that we have today. Today you have this idea of food security where every African country is trying to be self-sufficient on its own for its own thing, as opposed to thinking of food security for the continent, and then sort of playing on the relative strengths of different countries to say, how do we become food secure as a continent? But that means things like free trade agreements that are being signed actually functioning. It means being able to go from point A to point B easily and seamlessly. I mean, as an African, it's harder for me to travel within Africa than it is for me to travel, in Europe or in other parts of the world. We need to solve for those types of things. And then I would say there needs to be a Pan-African vision for agriculture, because each country going at it, for itself is going to make it ultimately way more expensive than saying, what is each country's relative strengths? What are the real investment opportunities that exist for agriculture in Tanzania versus in Ghana versus in Ethiopia versus in South Africa? They actually look different. And then how do we set up the right market mechanisms to ensure when we're talking about food security, that sort of becomes a uniting factor. The African Union today doesn't have that thing that binds it the way that its original institution, the OAU, which is the Organization of African Unity, had, which was decolonizing Africa. Like, can food security become that thing that our African leaders can come across the table on and actually structurally change things? I hope so, because if we don't, then I don't think each country going about it on its own is going to solve it.
To add to what she just said, another thing also is we should eat at home. And when I mean eat at home, it means in the continent, we should eat what's local. Because most of the foods that are very expensive are foods that are imported. And also mindset shift is very important, decolonizing the mindset. Because for me as a chef, one thing I've experienced, people glorifies going to dine out in an Italian restaurant for a lack of, it's not like I love Italian food, you know, and also not exploring our food enough. They don't see it as cool to go to an African restaurant to have a fine dining experience. So really placing value on what's local, I think is very important when it comes to stepping forward.
So during the time when the African continent, African leaders are doing this, I mean, what does that mean for the global community, right? Because it can't just be on smallholder farmers or African leaders to establish this. I mean, what can more developed economies do to support this journey for the continent? Tatika, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, that's... apparently, I will go into the private capitals because we are fully funded by private capitals, not in Africa, but outside. The money is coming from Asia to Africa. So I think it's also being patient and seeing the numbers. As we know, Africa has the highest land per capita. It has so much potential in agricultural production. And what more, where to plant than in Africa? In Europe, land is very expensive, and everyone is fighting for the same piece of land, whereas in Africa, there's so much potential. I think it would be about making agriculture in Africa sexy, because I'm pretty sure some of the investments here would not jump into agriculture because it's too, the tenor is very long, the ROI for investing in the sector is very high, and to exacerbate that to Africa. So it's two-way for us as well, working in Africa, to make it more conducive, to do some marketing, to make it palatable to the investors outside, especially in the developing countries. And at the same time, transfer the knowledge of what works in our countries, such as regenerative agriculture, which has been practiced in Brazil, in South America, in Europe, in even the United States of America. So I think there would be more dialogues, more understanding, and looking at the numbers. Where would you rather plant? In Europe with small pieces of land, but in Africa where we have so much vast land, significant amount of land.
Fatmata, can you talk about some of the experience that you've had, especially because you are a chef, and when Sarah's talking about a Pan-African approach, we were talking earlier about how you're sort of trying to fusion a lot of different cultures and sort of take this approach. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, so for me, it's really about promoting African gastronomy to start with, because I believe my dining concept, my restaurant, is a vehicle to actually champion change, you know, in my community. So, for example, if a diner comes to my restaurant, I'm telling the stories, I'm giving them knowledge about grains that they're supposed to use more. I'm sharing recipes. And also a lot of collaborations around the world with other chefs from East, West, South, even chefs outside of the continent. Something I usually do is I take ingredients with me. So key ingredients like fonio, like millet. When I'm collaborating, some of the chefs are Michelin star chefs. I'll give them as a gift, and I'll challenge them that create a recipe. Because for them, they don't have any emotional attachment or grandmother's recipes or rules to it, and they are very creative. They have a way more modern approach to ingredients. So they'll come up with very interesting things like fonio crackers, you know, millet bread, millet ice cream. And that sparks conversation, because when you share that on platforms, you add that to your menu, people are curious, like, oh, So there is a way I can actually use fonio without just sticking to the traditional way. So that's a way also, you know, to highlight and educate people about it. It's really about information, research, and when it comes to farming itself and how we can scale up, mechanization is very important. When I was looking for machines for my project in the north of Ghana, it was very challenging. I could easily find a machine in China, but I wanted to stick to also, you know, supporting local manufacturers. I had to go all the way to Senegal to buy a machine. Back to Ghana, the machine wasn't even working. So, you know, all of this, and there are ways to do it. There are institutes locally. You don't have to, the invention is important. Challenge universities, challenge institutions, you know, like these technical schools. Come up with, how can we create a machine locally, you know, and that can support these farmers. Finding a market for them. And just being part, create space to have these conversations and really do the work.
Sara, is there? Oh, yeah, I didn't know someone was clapping. Is there a world that exists where, as Fatmata was talking about, Africa, and I guess I should say in the short term, Africa is self-sufficient and able to feed other parts of the world? I mean, do you see that in the short term?
In the short term? Define short term?
I know. I mean, how far off are we from that, I guess?
Unfortunately, we're very far off, right? The promise of a green revolution has yet to come. And listen, we coined the term food security in the 1970s, right? Like, it was in the 1970s at some UN conference, Henry Kissinger actually came up with the term, and this whole promise of we have the technology and we have the know-how and we have the money, we have all these things for no kid to go hungry, for nobody to go to bed hungry. All, you know, there was a grand speech, and that's where the term food security came. Ever since then, for every major international conference, we still talk about food security and we still talk about the promise, right? And I think it ultimately sort of boils down to, do we have the leadership in place and the political will and the commitment to make the hard decisions, including maybe some potentially unpopular ones, right? Like, so Fatmata talked about the fact that we keep talking about small-scale farming, but we're not talking about scale. Because what scale does is it drives down the cost of production. And if the cost of production is high, you're not going to be able to be competitive in a global market, right? So to be competitive in a global market, you have to bring down the cost down of production. For that, you need scale. Now, I always say what shocks me is every time I go to an agricultural conference on the continent, I never see a Minister of Education in the same room as the Minister of Agriculture. And why I think those two go hand in hand is we need to scale agriculture for agriculture to work in Africa. That also means you have a very large population that needs an alternative set of industries to go be employed in, which means our education ministers and our education systems need to proactively plan so that the sort of only job that the next generation has is not to sort of tend to the family farm, right? And so I think if you come up with a way where you're actually planning this in a methodical enough way, you need scale. And for scale, you need to then tackle unemployment. That is going to happen at sort of large scale in the rural areas, which is why it's not popular to talk about moving from small-scale agriculture to large-scale agriculture. Is what's going to happen to all the people that are going to need the jobs if you don't have the small-scale farmers? Well, let's educate them so that there are alternative, you know, employment opportunities. And so I hate to be sort of dire, but if you ask me in the short term, do we stand a chance? The answer is no. With the right will and commitment, could we? Yes, because there's so much potential in just, if you look at the area where we're growing production today and just not even increase acreage, but just simply increase yields to the potential that each plot of land actually has, you would get to a net export number, right? So it's not even about increasing sort of acres under production. It's sort of simply using the acres we have under production correctly to be able to be sort of productive at the levels that we can. But I used to be a lot more optimistic.
One thing I want to add also, ownership. When it comes to farmers needs to own what they are growing. They need to be in charge. I feel like it shouldn't be just like they come in, they grow food, they harvest, they get peanuts, they move. If they understand the value of agriculture itself, and they are in charge, of what they are growing, I think it's a big way to motivate more farmers to grow more food and people getting into the agricultural sector. We need to prioritize it.
It needs to be a whole transformation, is what it sounds like.
Yeah.
Tatika, do you, yeah?
Yes, even if we convince farmers, where are the inputs for production? Where are the roads to transport inputs, to transport commodities? Who are the off-takers? Are you willing to give me the price as a farmer? So we need to convince the farmers to plant more efficiently and effectively, to utilize the soil very well, promote it so they could be passed on to generations. So it's a whole multifaceted short and long-term strategies that we farmers or governments and multi-stakeholders need to put their heads on so we could move forward to food sufficiency, maybe tomorrow or maybe 10 years from now. But I think if other countries, other continents have done it, then we could.
Does it get worse in the short term before it gets better? Or, I mean, there's some statistics saying that food insecurity has hit a 10-year high. Could it potentially get worse? I mean, is that what you all are anticipating? Or is there a turnaround happening right now, given the technological revolution and a lot of the other innovations that are coming up?
I think we need to wake up. There's definitely food crisis, shortage. If we don't start acting now, it's not looking good.
Tatika?
I'm more optimistic because amongst all the industry, food will not go away. We need food. And I feel that for every investor, the food industry, the demand is there. So there is always a market. So I think it's not, I see it like there is more hope. And I would continue to believe in being in this sector.
Sara?
So when you say food securities or insecurities at a 10-year high, that's right. It's potentially worse. And if you think of what it means, it's availability plus affordability. There are two factors to food security. We can have enough food, but if it's not affordable, then you're still going to have food insecurity challenges, right? And the continent faces both an availability as well as an affordability challenge. And when you say, why is that? Food prices globally on a dollar-denominated basis over the past year have come off drastically since the start of the war. I mean, that sort of was an all-time peak for sort of how we measure food prices, which is typically on a dollar-denominated basis. But people eat on a local currency basis. Yeah. And if you're a net importer of food, you are importing food using dollar reserves that you have and a currency that is significantly weakened.
Right. Which many countries don't even have a
So when you look at the price of wheat on a dollar basis year on year, it's down, 20+% in the past year in dollars. But if you look at the price of wheat imported into Egypt, it's up 40% than it was last year. So it's when you think about sort of food insecurity, and this is one of the greatest challenges for the global debate right now, is everybody's sort of of this mindset like, oh, we don't have this problem anymore because everybody's following dollar-denominated prices without taking into account which countries are net importers of food and what's their local currency done and what do you need for it. And then to add to that, you add actually an unprecedented debt environment of these countries, which is countries have borrowed huge amounts of foreign currency denominated debt over the past decade. Why? Because interest rates in the US were very low, so markets went seeking yield elsewhere. So lending money to Ghana or to Zambia, etc., on a sort of dollar-denominated basis became popular. And unlike our last debt crisis, where most of the debt was held by multilateral institutions that could restructure this debt, the debt environment that we sit in today and the countries sit on is very different. Most of the debt is not sitting with multilateral institutions. It's actually sitting in the hands of markets in the form of traditionally priced bonds. So you have a huge amount of debt that's coming due over the next 2 years that's foreign currency denominated. Currencies are weak. Food prices are high. You need the dollars to import the food, or are you going to default on your debt? So over the next 2 years, there's going to be this path that countries are going to be choosing constantly. Do I default? Do I save my dollars for imports? Well, whichever path you take, your currency gets weaker. So you get in this like really weird virtuous cycle. So we need to sort of start thinking of creative solutions, at least in the short term, around how to fix this, because the suffering is real on the continent, and most people do not realize it because everybody's following prices on a dollar-denominated basis.
And that's part of what Grow Intelligence is trying to do, right?
Trying. But it's hard. It's hard to convince so many different players. But I think what we try to do as a company, shine the light on the facts and the realities of where we are. We're a data company. You know, I always say I have opinions. I don't voice my opinions. I try to sort of bring the facts to the table, and we try to share the facts with all different players, as uncomfortable as they may be. But at least we can look them, you know, in the face and try to sort of come up with solutions.
Right.
Another thing I want to add to this that she said, I was shocked that wheat, honestly, even as a chef, I didn't know that wheat was coming from Ukraine. And then there was shortage. We needed to bake bread. And luckily, that time also, I launched the Global Chef Challenge with FAO, because, you know, they designated the entire 2023 to use more of millet. So we did this challenge. A lot of chefs were trying millet in different ways. And I tried to use fonio and millet to bake bread. It came out really nice. And for me, the question was, why is it that these are ancient grains that's been around for over 7,000 years? Most is gluten-free, very nutritious. Why is it that we are not using it? Why are we importing wheat from Ukraine and other places? So diversifying our food is very important. We cannot rely on few foods. We have to explore everything that we have. Eat local is a very important step to go forward in solving food security.
It's daunting, but there are real life things that people can do to take a stab
Baby
at this.
steps.
Baby steps
Yes.
is what the continent needs. Ladies, thank you so much. Sara, Tatika, Fatmata, thank you so much for your time. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.